Thank you so much for that wonderful and timely conversation. Our keynote speaker is Joan Bertin, Executive Director of the National Coalition Against Censorship. Founded in 1974, NCAC promotes freedom of thought, inquiry, and expression, working with teachers, librarians, authors, artists, parents, and others to oppose censorships of books, art, theater, and other forms of expression. A graduate of NYU Law School, Bertin practiced law for 25 years, first as a legal service lawyer and later at the ACLU. She has taught at Columbia University and Sarah Lawrence College. She speaks and writes on legal and policy issues and is a frequent contributor to professional books and journals.
Okay, tell me if you can't hear. Before I start, I want to say that we are providing a scanned copy of birthday cake for educational purposes to anybody who wants to teach about controversy. So just email me if you would like to see it as a PDF. We've had a morning of sort of a close-up, like censorship, book censorship under a microscope. And I want to now kind of step back and look at book censorship as a cultural phenomenon and how the censorship that we talk about within schools and libraries is really something that is that is emblematic of a much broader conversation that goes on in our country. And so with that frame, let me just start by saying all of us want to see our personal beliefs and values reflected and reinforced in our institutions. And particularly in the schools, where parents are invested not just intellectually in the ideas that are presented, but also emotionally in their children's upbringing. Obviously, however, since there's no single set of beliefs and values that is embraced by everybody in any community in this country, we know this is a problem. The problems inevitably arise around what I call cultural fault lines, which underlie many, if not most, censorship controversies. And here, let me just step back and say that I'm using the term censorship very loosely. We've had a lot of conversation about what really is censorship. Censorship legally is the government suppressing speech. But there are also forces in our society that result in the withdrawal of information, of ideas, the imposition of taboos, the silencing, which Alan Bruce mentioned earlier. So censorship is a slippery topic, but I'm going to try to use it in a broader sense as withdrawal of information and ideas from the public sphere. So some of these fault lines are obvious and very familiar. One of them is sex. We've heard a lot about it this morning, from Anthony Comstock's crusades to the prosecution of Margaret Sanger and other advocates of birth control, to the Hays Code's restriction on film, to protests against Elvis Presley's gyrations on television, to the furor over Judy Blume's books, which still continues to this day, to Jocelyn Elder's ill-fated mention of masturbation. Anxiety about sexual content has been behind an enormous amount of censorship. And Roby mentioned this morning that her book, 20 Years in Print, was just pulled from a library in Oregon this week because fourth graders might see it. They're over 9, and the book is recommended for 10-year-olds. So religion is another perennial reason why books are challenged. The Harry Potter books, for example, which have also been mentioned, were the most censored nationwide for a number of years, based on claims that, in the words of one complaint, they are a masterpiece of satanic deception. The same is true of racial references, also a topic of conversation this morning. HuckFit inspires challenges to this day, and teachers often report that they simply steer clear of it out of fear of either controversy or giving offense. These are all familiar topics to any student of censorship battles. However, today I want to focus on a different type of cultural conflict, specifically around politics and identity, which are fueling different kinds of censorship incidents, not unheard of, but different in quality and intensity. First, we've seen a spate of challenges to advanced placement United States history. The College Board issued a revised framework for, it's called APUSH, A-P-U-S history, APUSH in 2012, and it immediately became a flashpoint for politically active groups already mobilized in opposition to Common Core. Texas had adopted a law opposing the use of Common Core standards even before this. And in 2013, the Texas State Board of Education adopted a resolution targeting APUSH. That resolution says, quote, instructional materials should promote citizenship, patriotism, understanding of the essentials and benefits of the free enterprise system, respect for recognized authority, and respect for individual rights. The material should not include selections or works that encourage or condone civil disorder, social strife, or disregard of the law. Instructional materials should present positive aspects of the United States and its heritage. The Republican National Committee, seeking to capitalize on or capture this movement, officially denounced APUSH in 2014, calling it, quote, a radically revisionist view of American history that emphasizes the negative aspects of our nation's history while omitting or minimizing the positive aspects. Opposition to APUSH mounted, spearheaded in part by Project 912 groups and Tea Party groups around the country. In Jefferson County, Colorado, the school board proposed to revise the high school AP history course to ensure that, echoing Texas language, that materials promote citizenship, patriotism, and essential benefits of the free enterprise system, respect for authority, and to eliminate any materials that encourage or condone civil disorder, social strife, or disregard of the law. This last part, I think, is particularly interesting to anybody who knows anything about American history. Civil disorder is a feature of our the Revolution, the labor movement, the civil rights and gay rights movements, U.S. entry into World War I, voting rights protests, public opposition against the war in Vietnam, resistance to and support for abortion, government surveillance, and countless other significant events. Indeed, students under this law would not be allowed to read Thoreau on civil disobedience. The proposal in Colorado was met with protest by students, parents, and teachers, and it was narrowly defeated. However, similar proposals have cropped up in Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Kansas, Oklahoma, and other places, and have set off a wave of challenges to history textbooks overall. The College Board responded to the specific complaints by modifying the framework, which muted some of the protests. However, the controversy, to me, is nonetheless significant because it's indicative of underlying conflict over national identity as reflected in education. With parents, and someone mentioned this, I'm sorry, I think maybe David, with parents and lawmakers asserting that they should have control as opposed to educators or historians. I would hazard a guess that some of the same sentiment is contributing to the success of a candidate for the presidency who promises to make America great again. Okay, second is the virtual explosion of challenges to instructional materials about Islam, in which complainants construe teaching about religion with religious indoctrination. In Tennessee, a parent objected that a world history textbook presented a positive overview of Islam. A New Jersey parent said a different text glorifies suicide and violence. In Georgia, parents protested because the lesson about the tenets of the religion didn't include material about extremist elements. Maryland parents have filed a lawsuit in federal court against what they consider Islamic indoctrination and propaganda in a high school or history class. There have also been objections to two children's books, The Librarian of Basra, about a librarian in Iraq who saved books from destruction during the war, and Nazarene Secret School, about the story of a young girl who evaded the Taliban's ban on girls going to school. To some extent, again, the controversies over teaching kids about Islam echo some of the anti-Muslim and anti-immigrant rhetoric that we are hearing in political discourse. Perhaps both this example and the previous one is about a two-way street. Politicians are tapping into the anger and anxiety that underlies censorship, and their rhetoric in turn fuels the anger and anxiety that prompts more censorship complaints. Either way, what we see in terms of the censorship in schools reflects something larger in the culture. Third, let's get to complaints about LGBTQ materials. We knew this was coming. Complaints about materials featuring same-sex relationships, as we've heard this morning, have long been a stable ground for book challenges, at least since the 1989 publication of Heather Has Two Mommies by Leslie Newman. And it may have existed before then and continuing until 2014 and more recently, but I'm thinking of Emily Danforth's book, The Miseducation of Cameron Post in Delaware. In some respects, this is consistent with the fact that sexual content of any kind has historically been challenged, but the challenges have increased in number and in intensity as marriage equality gained widespread support and more recently gained legal protection. Lately, we've been seeing more challenges to books about transgender or gender non-conforming characters, such as I Am Jazz and My Princess Boy. Some of this is attributable to the fact that more books are raising these issues, but something else is going on too, as evidenced by the proliferation of legislative proposals targeting transgender and gender non-conforming individuals. These so-called bathroom laws, which would prohibit the use of bathrooms based on gender at birth, have been passed in legislatures in Indiana, Georgia, and North Carolina. Only in Georgia was the law vetoed, although it was modified slightly in Indiana in response to an outcry. I don't know how many people in this room, probably not too many, recall that when the Equal Rights Amendment was presented for ratification to the states in the 1970s, opponents claimed that it would require men and women to share bathrooms. The ploy was derided as potty politics, but it worked. The ERA has never been ratified. It remains to be seen whether potty politics will work again in the LGBTQ context. I raise these case studies about teaching history and Islam and the use of LGBTQ content to demonstrate how book censorship controversies reflect the tensions that exist more broadly in our communities. These and other challenges are not really debates about the kind of instruction and material that will help kids succeed in school and in life, but about whose norms, values, and beliefs will prevail. Censorship, after all, is really about thought control, and it is not confined to what kids read. This can also be seen in other kinds of censorious incidents involving efforts to control who gets to speak about certain topics and what they are allowed to say. For example, J.K. Rowling was recently accused of colonialism and cultural theft for incorporating the Navajo tradition of skinwalkers in her recent stories. As one critic put it, these are not her stories to tell. The issue of cultural appropriation is more familiar in controversies over the visual arts, but as the Rowling incident indicates, it's cropping up in literature too. But in the art context, last summer, the Boston Museum of Fine Art sponsored an exhibit called Kimono Wednesdays, in which visitors were allowed to try on a replica of the kimono that appears in Monet's iconic painting, La Japonaise. Critics charged that the exhibit was racist, quote, by way of cultural appropriation and cultural insensitivity. The exhibit had been well received in Japan, but when it came to the U.S., its critics called it a, quote, horrific display of minstrelsy. In their view, the exhibit represented a continuation of a tradition of exoticizing, this is a quote, a tradition of exoticizing the East through the lens of misogynist, white, patriarchal West, while contributing to the invisibilization and erasure of the Asian American Pacific Islander experience. Similar issues are raised by the recent disputes over the two children's books, the slides of which are still on the screen, A Fine Dessert and A Birthday Cake for George Washington. Critics were outraged by the images of the smiling slaves, apparently happily going about their work. The author and illustrator of A Fine Dessert apologized. No such apology was issued for Birthday Cake. Critics mounted an aggressive social media campaign, and the publisher Scholastic withdrew the book from circulation, although it denied that it was in response to the complaint. In this case, the issue is not about who is allowed to write about slavery, because the author, the creative team, the author, the illustrator, and the editor are all women of color, but how slavery should be written about. So the debate was about the narrative about slavery and who gets to control it. To the critics, there should only be one view of slavery, and any story that did not adhere to that view was not only false and misleading, but dangerous. Let me be clear, I express no opinion on the book or on the debate over its merits or deficiencies. I'm an advocate only for the right of authors and artists to express themselves however they choose, and for the right of readers to like something, hate it, or ignore it. I think Scholastic made a terrible mistake in pulling the book, because that decision denied people the right to decide for themselves what to think, and denied all of us the opportunity to have a conversation, even if that conversation is deeply uncomfortable. You could probably predict where I would come out on the Scholastic incident because of my job, the name of my organization, but you might not know why. I, as you heard, started my career representing legal services clients in welfare and housing disputes, and then became an advocate for or a civil rights litigator doing race and sex discrimination cases in employment. Even before that, however, growing up, I heard my parents talk about the McCarthy era. When I was in high school, 3 students no much older than I were killed in Mississippi during Freedom Summer. As a baby lawyer, I was shocked, along with many other people in the country, when a Senate Select Committee, known as the Church Committee, revealed in the mid-1970s that the FBI's counterintelligence program, otherwise known as COINTELPRO, had illegally targeted civil rights activists, feminists, anti-war demonstrators, and others, seeking to discredit them and their campaigns against inequality and injustice. I came to believe then, and I believe now, that the First Amendment and its principles provide the best protection for advocates for social change and unpopular causes, as civil rights, women's rights, and LGBT rights certainly once were, as well as the best protection for those who seek to promote respect and tolerance among people with divergent ideas and perspectives. I always urge advocates for justice to rely on the moral authority of their positions rather than on the exercise of power by those in authority. Power once unleashed cannot always be directed or controlled, and history suggests it will always be abused. One noteworthy example, after some feminists lobbied for laws to ban pornography, successfully in Canada, although not in the United States, one of the first prosecutions targeted a feminist bookstore for selling books describing lesbian sex. Freedom of speech is uncomfortable, and it imposes a heavy burden. It requires forbearance for hateful speech and the willingness to engage in the hard work of rebutting noxious ideas. It's challenging, messy, difficult, and never-ending. But I think, as they say about democracy, it's a terrible system, but it's better than all the others. So I would close with that, and with one further comment in response to the panel. Maybe an unpopular view, but in my opinion, literature is not safe, nor should it be. It is it is what unsettles us, what allows us to explore the things that we are afraid to talk about, and it allows us to explore dangerous ideas in a safe way. So I have some concerns about the notion that books should be safe. I'm not sure that I really want them to be safe. Would Toni Morrison's Beloved be out in the world if we only wanted safe books? I don't think so. Anyway, thank you.
Joan, where would you draw the line between censorship and editorial judgment? So, for example, an editor gets a birthday cake for George Washington and sees the drawings, recognizes the myth of history, which some conservatives love to peddle, that slaves were really happy and wasn't such a bad system, and reacts, saying to herself and to her colleagues, I think this is, a way of purveying historical falsehood and stereotypes, and I don't think we should publish it. So they haven't withdrawn the book because they've never published it. So where do you draw the line?
Well, I mean, one of the issues that was sort of being discussed was both the difference between censorship and selection, and the difference between the exercise of editorial judgment and censorship. And, in a funny way, with regard to your specific question, nobody has a right to have a book published. Hundreds of books, thousands, millions are not published. The authors go away disappointed. Now they can self-publish. Nobody has a right to have a particular book taught in school. The ALA actually has very interesting stuff on its website about the distinction between censorship and selection, and unfortunately it means that you have to sort of look at the motive of what underlies this. Is there an attempt to control how people think, what people think about a particular topic, or is it, this isn't a very good book? And certainly nobody's saying you should teach a book that's not a very good book. And maybe the judgment and Scholastic was wrong to publish it, but the problem is once having published it, pulling it is an extreme act. You know, I am hesitant to use the burning word, but it disappears a book in the same way that burning disappears a book. And then you're left with void. Personally, I think Scholastic should have done what Random House did, was take their lumps. They post a book, a lot of people don't like it, and maybe entirely justifiably. And they should have taken their lumps. I think Roger Sutton, basically made the same point in his commentary. So is there a bright line? Not really. But I do think there is one bright line, and that is that once something is brought out in the world, you can't really take it back. It's sort of like what you post online. It's there. It's going to be there forever. And you better deal with it. Other questions?
I just want to say one thing. I knew as soon as I said that thing about books being safe that was going to come back to haunt me. So what I want to do right now quickly is distinguish between safe and comfortable.
Yeah.
I fully support books that make people uncomfortable. I think there's a difference between those two things, and I suspect that we actually probably agree about
We
that.
probably do, and I tell you that I'm hypersensitive to this notion of safe space because of all the trigger warning stuff and all of the withdrawals of invitations to speakers because I don't feel safe. I mean, we're in a very strange place with regard to how do you confront the difficult issues that people have in their lives without feeling a little uncomfortable, without feeling a little unsafe. And it's become a kind of a trope that's, somebody mentioned the Atlantic article, coddling of the American whatever. And this is definitely a phenomenon that we see very prominently. But I would like to just make one point about it. It's not coming just from me. It comes from the left and the right and the middle. And the notion is that I shouldn't have to confront something that bothers me. Palestinian students and the Jewish students are at each other. Microaggressions. I mean, you can't live in the world unless you can figure out a way to talk about these things, in some kind of respectful level. And so I didn't mean to call you out on that, but I am super sensitive about the notion of the safe space.
Seems like I made you a little uncomfortable.
Oh, no, there it is again. But I'm glad you brought it up because I think it's a very difficult topic. I mean, we do seem to be in a really weird place culturally.
I wanted to bring up the idea of the fact that we do have intentions as a culture or as subgroups of a culture about what we want children to think, to believe, to experience, and to know. And I think that those intentions that have been expressed through the expertise of librarians and teachers across this country have made a real difference in the kinds of perceptions that young people have as opposed to the perceptions they had 10, 20, or 30 years ago. And that there's a kind of a dissonance in some ways between the intentions of experts in what it means to provide an education do, and then what gatekeepers in, for example, news outlets do, and that this has actually created a kind of a culture war in our country. And I experienced this personally in a very subtle but telling way when I was studying broadcast journalism in college. I was working for a small, very small, little tiny news outlet that did one show every day for half an hour about local news in Long Island. but the head teacher was this typical sort of, white male, news talking heads guy. And he sent me out on an assignment one day, and he said, okay, now I want you to go and cover the funeral of some American, some firefighters who died in 9/11, and while you're there, do a man on the street about gay rights. So I went out to this, classic sort of American Long Island town where everybody was out on the street, doing this thing, was pretty conservative, and I covered this funeral, and then I was like, I am not going to go up to these people and ask them what they think about gay rights, because I know what they think. There's going to not be reflective of the range of opinions of Americans about gay rights, because I'm in a particular context, and it's a conservative context. So I decided to stop off at the local college and ask the students what they thought, and every single young person, black, white, male, female, gay, straight, was like, we think gay marriage is fine. All the young people felt like gay marriage is fine, we should be supporting gay marriage. So I brought back my results, and the teacher and newscaster said, oh, no, that's biased. That's biased because you went to a college and you're only showing what young people think. But he didn't think it was biased for me to ask that question in the context of the funeral for the firefighters. Because to him, that was the real America, and what young people thought wasn't the real America. But what young people think is going to be the real America in the future, and I think that educators and librarians and teachers are doing a great job, and that's why they're under attack. And that we are intentionally changing our culture, hopefully for the better by having these conversations, but also we need to think about how we're framing the questions and what the context is.
I feel that's could I ask a question? Oh, going that way. Go ahead.
Come on.
Thanks, Ruby.
To follow up.
Well, sort of coming out of context, but also connecting back to the thought about safe spaces. I was wondering a little bit about, back to my notes so I can get it straight. I think it's about the responsibility of representation. And I really liked your final comment about it might not be the best system, but it's a good one, or it's a beginning.
Better than
I'm concerned though about the kids that sit in a classroom and a teacher picks up a book and opens it and doesn't know how to have the conversation, or maybe doesn't even recognize the book offers that conversation. So is that the responsibility to the editors, or there's something more here that's not censorship. We can't have books just going, I don't know, how are you hearing that?
You want to talk about this, Rosie, or?
No, you can answer, but I have a quick question.
Okay, yeah.
Oh.
I don't know how to answer that other than to say, haven't you had two teachers who did stupid stuff and you knew it, and you just said, okay, well, that's just her or him. I mean, teachers make mistakes. Everybody makes mistakes, and kids are not ruined. I mean, I had the thought that came to me when I read about the latest challenge to It's Perfectly Normal was, what, do they think these kids are going to turn into a pillar of stone if they see a cartoon drawing of sex? I mean, this is part of growing up, is sifting ideas, you hear bad ones all the time. Kids survive. My kids survive bad teachers, and we can't achieve a perfect score all the time. And that's part of the I think, the process of allowing this conversation, unruly conversation to happen, because that's how kids learn, well, I don't believe everything I hear, even if a teacher says it. Sometimes teachers are wrong. Roby,
I just wanted to say that we're all here for the issue, but I think underneath the issue, we're all here for children. I think every single person in this room thinks about children. And Joan, I guess what I wanted to ask you, I just read an article somewhere, who remembers, where you read anything now, about, and it wasn't dated, there were interviews with teachers, where teachers were saying that kids were doing more bullying, hate language in classrooms, and saying that they were watching debates, they were hearing what their parents had to say, whatever part of the spectrum of what parents say, where sometimes there's condoning. I'm just reporting this, not giving a value judgment on it. So I guess given how you started out your talk, I just wondered your thoughts or sense or gut feeling about today's kids who are living in this environment, and you talked about the politics of it and how you think that affects it. So I'm just wondering about the kids.
Well, the kids are picking up what their parents are saying, and other adults around them. You know, Trump doesn't exist in a vacuum. I mean, so, you know, if the kids are repeating what they're hearing on television, it's probably because their parents are also saying. I mean, yeah, it's scary times. Because we are hearing a lot of very angry, very hateful, very divisive speech. And I don't know where, but it's a much, to me, it seems like a much bigger phenomenon.
But do you think this is affecting the rising cases of censorship that you seem to be seeing?
Oh yeah, I definitely, that was the point I was trying to make, that I think the political discourse is fueling a lot of what is going on. And a lot of the anger that we see arising in the context of censorship, and the anxiety. Now that anxiety is probably real, that anger is real. One wishes that we had leadership that was persuasive, that would allow these conversations to happen in an instructive way, but now I'm out of my depth. But I do want to say one more thing, and I meant to start with this. There's been a lot of discussion today about the vulnerable place that teachers and librarians are. And I wanted to just say to everyone in this room, that's why we exist, so the teachers and the librarians don't have to be out there putting their jobs on the line. So someone else is making the point for them. And I know the ALA does the same thing, and Penn does the same thing, but that's why send teachers, send librarians to organizations like NCAC or ALA or National Council of Teachers of English, which is wonderful, and let those people help champion these books and negotiate these situations so that teachers are not themselves and librarians are not themselves vulnerable. None of us ever wants to see a teacher or a librarian get in trouble for defending the book. We are 100%. So next to the commitment to kids is the commitment to the teachers.
Thank you so much for your thoughtful comments, Joan.